Welcome back to Old School Sports. And we've been doing a playthrough of the Kansas City Royals for the past 16 seasons at this point in OOTP 23. It's been, as you can see, a pretty successful playthrough. So what I'm going to do now is kind of try to think about some of the things that have went well, some of the things that haven't gone well, specifically as far as our finances, our scouting, and our player development. And hopefully some things in here will be helpful to you as you try to build teams. If you're playing as the Yankees or the Dodgers, some of this stuff's not going to probably be as critical to get right, and to also, quite honestly, to just get lucky with sometimes. But if you're playing a middle or smaller market team, hopefully some of these suggestions will be pretty helpful to you as you try to handle the, as I mentioned, finances, the scouting and development, and maximize what the team can accomplish on the field. So taking a look at the finance tab, just kind of want to talk about where we've come with this team. When we started the playthrough, I believe the Royals were tied for 23rd in their budget at $142 million. We did get it up to 278 for the last season. We're going to be cut down to 268 for this upcoming season. We had won 3 World Series in the row, and this year, just a couple of weeks ago, we got bounced in the ALDS, so we made a lot less money from playoff revenue than in previous seasons. You can see that our playoff revenue in 2036, when we won the 3rd straight World Series, was close to $24 million. When we got knocked out in the ALDS this year, it was only about $8 million. So a negative $16 million delta there. And you can see that ended up with us losing money for the season. So ownership has backed our total budget down to $268 million. But we've still made very slow and steady progress on this over time, as I mentioned, from $142 million at the start. Player payroll is elevated right now. We've got some player options for this coming off season that we're likely to decline, that will push that down significantly, and probably some arbitration eligible players that will trade away. But when the playthrough began, the Royals payroll was 24th in baseball, around $93 million. So we've, managed to effectively double the player payroll, even though it will certainly be lower for the 2038 upcoming season than it was this past year. But the way we've done that is by managing the finances responsibly. Market size is something that is going to evolve extremely slowly in this game. When we started this in 2022 season, the market size was below average, and you can still see it's still below average today. Now, it has improved a little bit. It's gone from a yellow bar that was about here to a slightly longer green bar, but that's just something that's not going to change rapidly. But fan loyalty and fan interest, you can have a lot more control over. Fan loyalty, when we started, the game was poor. You can see it's good now. Clearly, having a lot of success on the field is going to help with that. And then there's also storylines that you can get involved in that can potentially help fan loyalty and fan interest. One of the ones that we talked about in our Kansas City Royals series that we've been doing for the past several months is the start a charity storyline. If you pay to invest and start that charity, it costs $16 million, so it's a big hit to your finances for the year when you do it, when the player comes and asks you to do it. But it does give you a bump in both fan loyalty and fan interest. So that's one way to improve that, in addition to improving it on the field. And then fan interest, it's winning on the field, having popular players, and having good players. And one of the ways to do that, particularly when you're starting a relatively new sim, is to try to find some free agents who are either popular locally or popular, well-known nationally. If you're in a situation where you need a backup catcher and you can get somebody who's well-known nationally, well-known locally, or even better, very popular, or extremely popular, you can definitely try to fill out those last couple spots on your roster, some bullpen positions with players that are probably replacement level players, but you want to bring those popular guys on board rather than someone who's not as popular to get a little bump in the fan interest, because that will ultimately allow you to get more fannies in the seats, as Chris Mad Dog Russo likes to say. You can see that our ticket price has been over $40 for this past season, and our attendance is almost selling out every game. That's a big function of, again, having been very successful on the field and kind of building up that ticket price over the last 16 years running the sim. You can see we've pretty much been close to selling out throughout the sim, and our revenue per game is about $1.5 million, which is much larger than it was when the sim started. And again, winning on the field, building up fan interest, and building fan loyalty are the ways to not just get more fans in the seats, but also to be able to charge them more. And all of that will ultimately fall through onto your income statement in the season ticket revenue line for the season tickets you sell, the gate revenue line for the non-season ticket sales that you have. And then obviously if you're a successful team and you're getting into the playoffs, that's an area where you can really have a very significant impact on one-year finances if you make a long run in the playoffs. So improving fan loyalty, improving fan interest, and most importantly, having a team that's successful on the field that people want to come see are some of the key ways to generate more money, which is obviously going to let the team spend more in free agency. It's going to let the team keep more of their players as they go through arbitration and then eventually get eligible for free agency themselves. And it's going to allow the team to invest a lot more in scouting and development, which are two critical areas to kind of building a team that hopefully can be a sustainable and long-term winner. And we'll talk about scouting and development more going forward. You can see that with the Royals here, the last several years I've had the maximum $24 million devoted to the scouting budget, and then I've had $36 million devoted to the development budget. Some people will say that the scouting budget isn't that important, and I disagree with that, and we'll talk about why shortly. Clearly, if you're taking over a team like the Royals or the Pirates or the Marlins, some of the more challenging teams with more difficult financial situations, you're not going to be able to be investing $24 million in scouting and $36 million or thereabouts in development at the start. But if you do start building up fan interest and fan loyalty by winning more games than the previous season and bringing on, again, some players who may be replacement level players but do have the fans interested in them, you can start increasing this budget little by little, year by year. And what I would suggest is you obviously want to invest some of that money into free agents, into long-term contracts for your key players, but just make sure that you're always constantly trying to increase scouting and development. As I mentioned, scouting got it maxed out at $24 million. I would try to get it there in any playthrough I do as soon as possible. And admittedly, that could take a decade with some teams. Development, what we learned when OOTP released some of their tutorials at the beginning of the OOTP 23 release, is that after about $30 million you start to get significantly diminishing returns from your development budget. And after about $40 million, it's very little to no additional return. So I would say the goal with development is to get it up to around 30 million as soon as you possibly can. And you can see we've been running it higher than that, even though I acknowledge we're, probably not, certainly not generating as much return on development out of that last 6 million as the previous 6 million because of the diminishing returns associated with it. But when you look at the number of players you have throughout your minor league system who are going to be positively impacted in terms of their development by the money that you're investing in that development budget, it's money that is extremely well spent. And the other thing that you need to think about, and I know that this can be, some people view this as a hassle, but you want to make sure that you've got the best coaches possible throughout your minor league system. If you invest a lot in player development and you've got pitching coaches who are good at teaching pitching, good at development, good at mechanics, and you've got hitting coaches that are good or better at teaching hitting, and again, very good at development and mechanics, having those excellent coaches in conjunction with investing a lot in player development is going to really help in terms of getting to a situation where even if you have a year like the Royals have upcoming where our budget's been cut by $10 million, you're going to have good young players coming up through your farm system that you can potentially plug in at the major league level if you do need to shed some contracts. So focusing on getting the best coaches possible. And again, I would not fight with, when you're hiring personnel, if you can bring on a better coach in the minor leagues for an extra $10,000 a year, $20,000 a year, even $50,000 a year compared to a coach that is somewhat less effective, I always try to go for the best coaching possible. Ultimately, in a game like this, in the background, the coaches who are excellent and legendary in their skills in these areas are just giving you extra tiny pluses here and there as the players potentially develop. But if you combine that with a lot of money in the development budget, you can really create a situation where, as we were fortunate to do with the Royals, where you can have pretty sustained success over a long period of time as your farm system just continues to, kind of replenish itself and give you much more cost-effective players for the major league roster. And I mentioned earlier that investing as much as possible in scouting is something that I think is probably more important than, maybe your average person who plays the game. Clearly, having an excellent scout is critical to kind of knowing about the talent throughout the majors, minors, international, and amateurs. You can see that with Travis Lee, we've got a scout who's outstanding in the majors, excellent in the minors, legendary in international, and excellent with the amateurs. He's a highly favored tool scouts, which is probably the most favored way to go as far as the OOTP 23 community. And I think that this may be different than some people think, and we'll talk about why I believe this, but I think the international scouting rating is the most important one for you to think about when you are putting scouts together or finding a scout and hiring a scout. And I also think that putting the most money of your allocation between majors, minors, amateur, and international into international scouting is also the most important thing that you can do. And the reason why is that extra money in international scouting, as well as having an international scout who is incredible at doing their job, is one of the only things that you can do in the game that will differentiate you from the rest of the teams in the league. When you think about international amateur free agents, you get one shot, just like every other team in the league, on July 1st when the international amateur free agents come out. The theory there is normally put $5 million onto the player that you like the best, hope he signs with your team. If he doesn't, hope that someone you still like a lot is around by June 5th, June 6th, or July 5th, July 6th, whenever you find out that he didn't agree to sign with you. Give them a $5 million offer, and then at some point you either decide that there's nobody you want that year, or you spend $5 million to kind of bring on the best player possible. But and I know that there are some teams that try to spread it out. I'm going to give $3 million to this guy and $1 million to another couple guys, so I can take 3 shots in the international scouting pool. I've never had a lot of luck with that, but I know that is something that people do. But essentially, with international amateur free agents, you get one guy a year. Amateur scouting, obviously, the amateur draft is going to be the backbone of building any team. But you get 1 out of every 30 picks. Now, if you're a crappy team, you're picking before a team that's in the playoffs every year in each of those rounds, so that works in your favor. But you're still ultimately, in terms of amateur scouting, 1 out of every 30 players in that amateur draft is going to come to you, because there's no draft pick trading unless you change that setting. And obviously on the margins with compensatory picks, you can get an extra pick from time to time. But that is ultimately still very balanced. Now, you want someone who's good at scouting amateurs or excellent, and you want a lot of money in there so you know the market and you know who's out there and you can make good decisions. But again, with the amateur scouting, you're only going to get 1 out of every 30 players onto your team through the draft, because that's just the way that the draft works. But the one thing that I think is underappreciated in the game is if you have a great international scout and you're investing a lot of money into international scouting, you're going to do a lot better with your scouting discoveries. And these are the players that, you'll generally get about 20 to 2 dozen a year who will go into your international complex. As you can see, a lot of them are not all that exciting in terms of being prospects. But you will, from time to time, have your scout discover someone who's a diamond in the rough. The perfect example with our team is Alex Vasquez, who was a scouting discovery back in November of 2022, just coming off a season when he led the league in homers and runs batted in and just missed out on a Triple Crown. May have cost him the batting title on the last day of the season. But you can see that this is a excellent hitter, and he has been an incredible offensive player over the course of his career. Another example of a player that we picked up through a scouting discovery who's been a pretty important player to us in recent years in this playthrough is our second baseman, Aguiar Laziosi, who was a scouting discovery in 2027. You can see he's been our starting second baseman for the last several seasons, has been an above-average offensive player, and he's also a very versatile and a solid defensive player. Another player who we picked up in terms of a scouting discovery who's been in the majors, Leo Aguiar. He's actually been down in Omaha this entire last season, but he has been a really nice backup catcher for us and a cheap backup catcher for us for the first 4 years of his career before he spent the entire season down in Omaha. Another guy who we picked up more recently, scouting discovery from 2031, Luis Linares, who very good defensive player. You can see he can play second, third, or short. Great range. His error rating, certainly not optimal for a shortstop or a second baseman. His best defensive position is probably third base, but he can play either of those other positions, and looks like he could have a pretty solid major league bat. As I mentioned, another scouting discovery of ours. And the scouting discoveries that you get, as I mentioned, most of them are going to be half-star players with half-star potential. But if you're investing more money in your development budget, your scouting budget, and you've also got the international slider as far to the right as you can in terms of the allocation that you're putting into international scouting, you're going to find more of those scouting discoveries who are players like the ones I just mentioned who can actually make a difference at the major league level. And as I mentioned, in the amateur draft, you get 1 out of 30 players. In international amateur free agents, you're generally going to get 1 player a year if you're lucky. There will probably be some years where you get nobody. So those across Major League Baseball are pretty democratic, pretty fair, not a lot of differentiation. But if you invest a lot of money in international scouting and you've got a great international scout, you're probably not going to find a player like Alex Vasquez every year. But over time, you are going to get some of those better players into your system, and having players in your system, like the guys that I just went through, who other teams aren't getting, is a way to really differentiate yourself in terms of the talent in your minor league system. Obviously, doing well in the draft is critically important. Obviously, signing good free agents is important. Obviously, player development and actually developing the talent that you bring into the system is important. But I do think that the opportunity to get those major league quality international prospects that your scout just happens to find is probably an unappreciated area in the game, and one where if over time you are able to invest more in scouting, have a great scout at international, and ultimately put as much money as you can into international scouting, you're going to have a better chance when the virtual rolls of the dice are going on in the background in this game of finding players that can really make a difference for your team in the future. And one other suggestion I would have as far as finances, particularly when you're not playing with the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Red Sox or the Cubs or the teams that generally are going to be more successful financially with bigger budgets, is if you have a bad contract, as soon as you figure out it's a bad contract, you've got to do everything in your power to get out of it. And that could include trading away some pretty good prospects. If you get to a point where you're investing a lot in scouting, you're investing a lot in development, you've got a good coaching staff, you've got an excellent scout, and particularly, as I talked about, if you're over-investing compared to other teams in terms of your international scouting, you should have some pretty good talent coming through your system and churning through your farm system over time. But paying a bad player $15, $20, $25 million a year for an extended period of time is potentially going to cripple your franchise. Even with a team like the Royals, where we've gotten the payroll and the budget to be, the budget is literally, or it was last literally almost double was it was when we started this playthrough in 2022. But even in a situation like that, if you've got a really bad contract, particularly one that goes on for several years, you're going to be able to be a lot more competitive over the next few seasons of that contract if you get it off the books. And you may have to retain part of it. And as I said, you may also have to put some good players into it. But you've got to do what you got to do to get that horrible contract off the books before it becomes an anchor. You know, thinking about the start of OOTP 23 and the beginning of the 2022 season, I think the contract that people kind of view that way most prominently is probably Miguel Cabrera with the Tigers. But as a Yankees fan, even though it's not the same kind of magnitude of dollars per year that the Tigers are on the hook for with Cabrera, you know, I look at the Aaron Hicks contract, and that's one that I kind of want to get off my books as soon as possible. And in this playthrough with the Royals, we had a really sad example of a contract that became real horrible, real fast, that we needed to get off the books. Those of you who watched parts of the Royals playthrough may remember the sad story of Shi Tong Kin. This was a player that we signed as a minor league free agent out of Taiwan. Quickly brought him up to the majors, and you can see hit 297 as a rookie with 25 homers, 92 runs driven in, 142 OPS plus. Next year hit 293, 25 homers, 114 runs driven in. We paid him, I believe, $5 million each of those years. If I could click on the right thing in the history, I think I can show you that. Yeah, he was $5 million a year for those first 2 years when he ended up on the major league roster for us. And coming out of that 2029 season, we signed him to a long-term deal. We were like, this guy is young. He's incredible. We want to lock him up and hopefully build a dynasty around him, because he was also a very versatile and a very good infielder at the time. You can see his defensive ratings from, you know, when he was at his peak. He was a very good defensive player. And at one point, he was an excellent offensive player. So we signed him to an 8-year extension at $122 million, October 13th, 2029. And that is when he really began a rapid decline. When we came back at the beginning of the 2030 season, and unfortunately, since he's retired, we don't have all of the reports to kind of show the history for this. But when he came back at the start of that 2030 season, it was very weird, because you can see he was 24 years old at the start of the season, coming off 2 great years, and all of a sudden his ratings just started completely to go down. He was an above average contact, above average power, above average eye, and a very good defensive player. And everything just started going wrong with him. And you can see he batted $187 over the first half of the season, 278 at bats. His ratings just continued to go down. And we made what maybe was a panicked decision at the time, but in retrospect worked out well for us. Because you can see we were on the hook for $8 million that year. Then he was going to be getting 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20 over the course of the next 8 years of that deal. So we dealt him to the Rockies. And we also had to throw in Jose Rodriguez, who, when we look at his history, he was a 4th round pick from ours of ours, back in 2028, and was a pretty good prospect. But we, at that point, had decided we needed to do anything possible to get that contract off of our books. We got back a little bit of money, and then we got back a catcher, Luis Rodriguez, who you can see we traded away not too much after that, and it actually looks like he's put together a major league career. I don't know if I would say it's a great major league career, but certainly looking at what he's done at the major league level, he's been a backup catcher for a decade at this point. So although he doesn't hit all that much, probably a player we shouldn't have given up on so quickly. And then we also got a starting pitcher, Easton Tumis, back, who pitched okay for us for a few seasons, you can see. But we eventually moved on from him also. But it honestly was not about what we were getting back. We would have taken back a pile of dirt, quite honestly, and we would have thrown in an even better prospect than Rodriguez to get that money off of our books. And you can see we would have had him through 2036 on our books if we hadn't traded him. And if we had waited, when you look at his stats, he never really got any better. He had some pretty rough seasons in Colorado. I guess you could say at the age of 28 in 2034, he bounced back a little bit when he hit 254 with 14 homers, but still a below average year offensively. Did put up a 2.1 WAR. But those first two seasons with us, he put up a 9.4 WAR. You can see he retired with a 9.1 WAR. So he was a below average major league player basically since the time we traded him along, because he actually had a positive WAR even in that horrible 187 batting season with us because he was such a good defensive player at the time. So he was a negative WAR player, and Colorado ended up spending close to $120 million on that contract that we had signed him to. If we had not traded away Kin, I think it's pretty unlikely that we would have won 4 World Series in the time that he would have been under contract with us. That literally opened up, as I talked about, close to $120 million that we were able to invest into players who were more productive than Kin would have been over that time period. Certainly you don't know what would happen with any certainty, but I think that that's a good example. If you see a player whose ratings just drop off the face of the earth, or, in the more likely scenario, if you've got a player who's in his mid to late 30s who you had to sign to a long-term deal to get him under contract when he was a free agent or a pending free agent, and all of a sudden he's 36 years old, your scout says, ooh, it looks like it's getting a little rough with him. His ratings are starting to go down in terms of the scouting reports. His performance on the field is starting to go down. I think it's critical to get that player off of your roster as soon as possible. And if you don't get anything back in return, that's probably fine. And if you have to give up something of some quality in return, I think that's fine too. Again, if you're not the Yankees or the Dodgers or some of those other big market teams, you just can't afford to have an anchor of a contract on the books, especially if it's a long-term contract. So the key takeaways, and I'm repeating myself hopefully at this point, you're going to need money to build a winning franchise. And in some cases, this is circular logic, because to get money, you need a winning team. But building by investing in scouting and investing development, so you can do well in the draft, you can do well with international amateur free agents, And again, the X factor in my view is being able to do really well with international scouting discoveries. But if you can do well in those things, you can ultimately build a winning team. If you build a winning team, you're going to increase fan loyalty. You bring on popular players, you're going to increase fan interest. That's going to allow you to charge higher prices for tickets. That's going to allow you to have more people who want to come and watch the games, even at those high prices. That's going to allow you to go on longer playoff runs where you can make some real extra money for your franchise. So it's all kind of connected. And again, the last big point that I think I made was if you've got a bad contract, do whatever you need to get out of it. Don't let it become an anchor on your franchise, because it's ultimately going to have an impact on your win-loss record, because you're going to have a player on your team who you probably don't want to have on your team because he's not that effective at this point. And it's also going to impact the amount of money you have to spend on other players, and it's just going to kind of contribute to a cycle where your team does worse, less people want to go to the games, your budget shrinks, and just becomes a downward spiral that's going to have an impact on your team over the course of several seasons. So those are a few random thoughts on hopefully how to do a little better with some of the financial scouting development and contract issues in OOTP 23. I hope it was helpful. If you've got other thoughts, would love to hear them down below. If you've got other ideas, would love to hear them down below. Share what you think I have wrong, what you think I have right, or most importantly, what I didn't say and didn't think of that needed to be said down below, so others can kind of hopefully learn from your successes and failures also. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.